My younger sibling Alex is not the same person they were before. The vibrant spark that once defined them, a quick wit paired with an infectious laugh, was extinguished years ago, replaced by a quiet, often unsettling stillness. For a long time, we, as a family, walked on eggshells, navigating the aftermath of an unspeakable act committed against them. The perpetrator, a former friend, someone we had welcomed into our home and trusted implicitly, had shattered Alex's world and, by extension, ours. The details of what happened are etched into my memory, a constant, burning reminder of a betrayal so profound it defies comprehension. It wasn't just a moment of cruelty, it was a deliberate, calculated violation that left scars far deeper than any physical wound. For years, a veil of silence had shrouded the truth, a desperate attempt to protect Alex from further pain, to allow them some semblance of peace. But recently, that veil was lifted, not by our choice, but by circumstance. Alex, through a series of unrelated events, stumbled upon information, fragments of memory, and finally, the undeniable, horrifying truth of what had transpired. The revelation was a fresh wound, tearing open old scars and exposing the raw, unhealed trauma beneath. It was agonizing to witness, to see the pain resurface with such intensity, a pain that had been dormant but never truly gone. My heart ached for Alex, for the innocence stolen, for the years lived under the shadow of a lie. The individual responsible, Mark, had, in the intervening years, not only escaped any form of accountability but had flourished. He had built a life of apparent success, a gleaming facade of respectability. He was the picture of a self-made man, admired in his community, seemingly untouched by the darkness he had inflicted. He moved through the world with an air of entitlement, his past buried deep beneath layers of carefully curated public image. And when the truth, or rather, the possibility of it, began to surface, his reaction was precisely what I had come to expect from such a person. A swift, dismissive wave of denial, an attempt to minimize, to reframe, to distort. He painted Alex as unstable, as prone to exaggeration, as someone seeking attention. He spun a narrative designed to protect his carefully constructed reality, to deflect any blame, to maintain his unblemished reputation. His audacity, his casual cruelty, was a fresh insult, a slap in the face to Alex's suffering and our family's enduring pain. This callous disregard, coupled with the stark reality of his prosperity, ignited something within me. I had always believed in justice, in the inherent fairness of the system, in the idea that wrongdoers would eventually face consequences. We had, in the immediate aftermath of the initial incident, explored every avenue, every legal recourse available to us. We had spoken to lawyers, navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the justice system, and presented what we believed was irrefutable evidence. But the system, in its infinite wisdom and often infuriating limitations, had failed us. Technicalities, lack of definitive proof that met the stringent legal thresholds, the passage of time, all conspired to protect Mark, to allow him to walk free, unburdened by his monstrous actions. The experience left me hollowed out, disillusioned, and utterly devoid of faith in abstract justice. The scales were not balanced. They were irrevocably tilted in favor of the powerful, the manipulative, the unrepentant. My belief in the traditional pathways to justice evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. If the system wouldn't hold him accountable, then I would. But not in the way they expected. Not through the courts, not through emotional appeals, not through seeking closure or healing. My focus shifted entirely. I no longer sought vindication or emotional catharsis. My objective became singular, precise, and unyielding, persistent inconvenience and ruin. I wanted to dismantle his life, piece by legal piece, to strip away the layers of his carefully constructed prosperity, to expose the rot beneath the polished surface. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense, it was about rebalancing the scales, not with abstract justice, but with tangible, undeniable consequences. I needed actionable, non-illegal strategies, methods that would operate entirely within the bounds of the law, yet be profoundly disruptive. My family had suffered enough. It was time for Mark to experience a fraction of the chaos he had wrought. The road ahead was long, fraught with ethical complexities, and demanded absolute precision. There would be no room for error, no impulsive moves. Every step had to be meticulously planned, every action vetted for its legality and its potential impact. My mind, once consumed by grief and helplessness, began to reorient itself, shifting into a mode of detached analysis, a strategic calculation of weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Mark had built his empire on a foundation of deceit and indifference. It was time to find the cracks in that foundation and, with surgical precision, begin to widen them. This wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon, a slow, methodical dismantling. And I was prepared to run it, no matter how long it took. The shift in my mindset was not instantaneous, but rather a gradual hardening, a crystallization of purpose forged in the fires of frustration and despair. The initial shock of Alex's renewed pain had given way to a quiet, simmering rage, but it was a rage I learned to control, to channel into something productive. I stopped dwelling on the what-ifs, or the if-onlys. The past was immutable. The future, however, was still malleable. My emotional landscape transformed from a turbulent sea of grief into a calm, icy lake, its surface reflecting a singular, unwavering objective. Every thought, every action, began to orbit around this new center: how to legally, effectively, and relentlessly dismantle Mark's carefully constructed world. My first step was to become an expert on Mark. Not just on the superficial details of his public life, but on the intricate web of his professional and personal existence. I started with open-source intelligence, a deep dive into every publicly available piece of information. His company's filings, his past addresses, his social media footprint, both current and archived, his professional affiliations, any public records of his dealings, even local news archives that mentioned his name or his business ventures. It was tedious, painstaking work, often stretching late into the night, fueled by strong coffee and an unyielding resolve. I cross-referenced data, looked for discrepancies, for patterns, for anything that seemed even slightly out of place. I learned about his business partners, his investors, his suppliers, his clients. I mapped out his network, identifying key relationships and potential pressure points. This wasn't about digging up dirt in the traditional sense, or finding something illegal he had done in the present. The goal was far more subtle. It was about understanding the mechanisms of his success, the foundations upon which his prosperity rested. Was it his reputation? His network? His financial stability? His compliance with obscure regulations? His relationships with specific individuals or organizations? I needed to understand the precise levers that, when pushed, could cause maximum disruption without crossing any legal lines. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was looking for 1,000 tiny pebbles that, when strategically placed, could cause an avalanche. I immersed myself in legal texts, not to become a lawyer, but to understand the boundaries. I devoured information on consumer protection laws, regulatory compliance, corporate governance, intellectual property, even obscure local ordinances. I learned about the power of public records requests, the intricacies of business licensing, the nuances of defamation laws, and how to avoid them. My aim was to identify every single point of potential friction, every bureaucratic hurdle, every minor infraction or oversight that could be escalated, every legal obligation that could be rigorously enforced. I wasn't interested in making a grand accusation. I was interested in making his life a continuous, low-grade nightmare of paperwork, audits, investigations, and public scrutiny, all initiated through perfectly legitimate channels. The more I researched, the clearer my strategy became. This wasn't about emotional satisfaction. It was about the cold, hard logic of consequence. Mark had operated with impunity, believing himself untouchable. He had minimized Alex's suffering, dismissing it as a triviality. My objective was to show him, through a series of entirely legal actions, that there were indeed consequences for his actions, even if they weren't the ones dictated by a court of law. It was about creating a constant, low-level hum of disruption in his life, a persistent, unignorable static that would erode his peace, his time, and eventually his prosperity. My first tangible step was almost imperceptible, a mere whisper in the vast noise of the internet. I began by meticulously documenting every public claim Mark or his company had ever made, cross-referencing them with verifiable facts. I focused on the minutiae: product specifications, service guarantees, environmental claims, employee benefits, anything that could be objectively measured or verified. I wasn't looking for lies, but for exaggerations, for ambiguities, for anything that could be interpreted differently by a vigilant consumer or a diligent regulatory body. This was the intelligence gathering phase, the foundation upon which I would build my campaign of disruption. It was a patient, methodical process, devoid of emotion, driven solely by the desire for an unconventional form of justice. I was building a detailed dossier, not for a prosecutor, but for myself, a roadmap to his undoing, one perfectly legal step at a time. The dossier grew day by day, a meticulously organized compendium of Mark's public life and business dealings. It wasn't just raw data, it was analyzed, cross-referenced, and annotated with potential vulnerabilities. I categorized information by type: financial records, regulatory filings, marketing claims, employee reviews, customer feedback, and even seemingly innocuous social media posts. Each piece of information was scrutinized for inconsistencies, for any claim that could be challenged, any promise that could be tested, any statement that could be held up to rigorous scrutiny. My goal was to create a comprehensive map of his operational landscape, identifying every potential pressure point. One particular area of focus became his business. Mark ran a moderately successful enterprise, a service-based company that relied heavily on its reputation and client trust. This was a critical vulnerability. Reputation, I reasoned, was a fragile thing, easily tarnished by persistent, legally sound questioning. I began to delve into the specifics of his industry, understanding its regulations, its best practices, and the common pitfalls. I learned about the various licensing bodies, professional associations, and consumer protection agencies that oversaw businesses like his. These were the channels I intended to leverage. My strategy was not to defame him, which would be illegal and counterproductive. Instead, it was to encourage the legitimate, legal scrutiny of his operations. I started by identifying specific, verifiable claims his company made in its marketing materials. For example, if they advertised a certain level of service guarantee, I would, as an anonymous but concerned citizen, inquire with relevant consumer protection agencies about the enforceability or transparency of such claims. If they boasted about environmental certifications, I would research the actual requirements for those certifications and then, again, anonymously, submit inquiries to the certifying bodies about the rigor of their auditing processes, perhaps even subtly hinting at potential discrepancies without making direct accusations. This was a game of precision and plausible deniability. My communications were always polite, factual, and phrased as genuine inquiries from a concerned citizen or a potential client. I never made accusations. I merely asked questions that, if pursued by the relevant authorities, would necessitate Mark's company spending time, money, and resources to answer. Each inquiry, no matter how small, represented a drain on his resources, a distraction from his core business, and a potential source of stress. It was like 1,000 paper cuts, individually insignificant, but cumulatively debilitating. I also paid close attention to online reviews and forums related to his industry. I noticed patterns in customer complaints, minor issues, often dismissed by the company, but recurring. I didn't post negative reviews myself, but I would, again, as an anonymous, concerned citizen, engage with these discussions, subtly directing other users to the appropriate channels for formal complaints or regulatory inquiries. Have you considered reporting this to the XYZ Consumer Bureau? Or, did you know that the ABC Licensing Board handles issues like this? These were not calls to arms, but gentle nudges towards legitimate avenues of redress, empowering others to create the very scrutiny I desired. The beauty of this approach was its legality. I was not fabricating evidence, spreading rumors, or engaging in any form of illegal harassment. I was simply exercising my rights as a citizen to inquire, to question, and to encourage the proper functioning of regulatory bodies and consumer protection mechanisms. The burden of proof and the burden of response would fall squarely on Mark and his company. Each inquiry, each complaint, each investigation, no matter how minor, would require his attention, his lawyer's time, and potentially his financial resources. I also began to explore the more obscure corners of regulatory compliance. Many businesses, especially those that have grown rapidly, often overlook minor but legally significant details. Perhaps a specific permit was slightly out of date, or a particular disclosure was not as prominent as required by law, or a certain type of employee training was not fully compliant with the latest regulations. These were not major crimes, but they were technical violations that, if brought to the attention of the right agency, could trigger audits, fines, or even temporary operational restrictions. My research became a hunt for these minute cracks, these seemingly insignificant oversights that, when exposed, could cause disproportionate disruption. This was a long-game strategy, requiring immense patience and a detached, almost academic approach. I wasn't looking for immediate gratification. I was planting seeds of inconvenience, knowing that they would take time to sprout and grow into a thorny thicket around Mark's operations. The goal was to create a constant state of low-level crisis for him, to make his life a never-ending series of administrative headaches and financial drains, all while remaining entirely anonymous and legally unimpeachable. The justice system had failed Alex, but I was determined to create a parallel system of consequences, one where Mark's prosperity would slowly but surely erode under the relentless pressure of perfectly legal scrutiny. My focus widened beyond just his business operations. Mark's personal life, particularly his public-facing aspects, also became a target for strategic, legal disruption. He was involved in several community organizations, held a position on a local board, and was a donor to various charities. These affiliations, while seemingly innocuous, were built on a foundation of perceived integrity and good standing within the community. My objective was to subtly chip away at that perception, not through direct accusation, but through the introduction of legitimate, yet inconvenient, scrutiny. I began by examining the bylaws and ethical guidelines of each organization Mark was associated with. Many nonprofits and community boards have strict codes of conduct regarding conflicts of interest, ethical behavior, or even public statements by their members. I would then, again, anonymously send well-researched, factual inquiries to the leadership of these organizations. These inquiries would never mention Alex or the past incident directly. Instead, they would focus on hypothetical scenarios or general questions about the organization's commitment to its ethical guidelines, subtly hinting at potential discrepancies without ever making an explicit link to Mark. For instance, if a board's bylaws stated a clear policy on transparency in financial dealings, I might send an email asking, as a concerned community member, I was reviewing your organization's commitment to transparency, particularly regarding donations from individuals with complex business structures. Could you clarify how you ensure full disclosure and avoid potential conflicts of interest in such cases? This was not an accusation, but a general query that, if taken seriously, would prompt the organization to review its internal processes, potentially leading to increased scrutiny of Mark's contributions or involvement. Similarly, if a charity emphasized its commitment to protecting vulnerable populations, I might inquire about their vetting process for board members or major donors, asking how they ensure that individuals with any history of questionable conduct, again, without naming Mark or the specific incident, are not in positions of influence. These inquiries were designed to trigger internal discussions, to raise red flags, and to make Mark's continued presence on these boards or as a prominent donor a source of mild discomfort and administrative burden for the organizations themselves. The goal wasn't to get him immediately removed, but to make his association with them less seamless, less beneficial, and more of a liability. I also looked into his property holdings and any public records related to them. Minor zoning variances, unaddressed code violations, or even disputes with neighbors that had been publicly documented, these were all potential avenues. I wasn't looking for major crimes, but for the kind of small-scale issues that, if reported to the right municipal department, could lead to inspections, fines, or requirements for remediation. A neighbor's overgrown hedge, a slightly non-compliant fence, a permit that was never officially closed out, these were the trivialities that could become disproportionately annoying when pursued relentlessly by an anonymous, well-informed citizen. My strategy was becoming increasingly sophisticated, a multi-pronged attack on every facet of his public and semi-public life. It was a war of attrition, fought not with grand gestures, but with a relentless barrage of administrative friction. Each inquiry, each complaint, each subtle nudge toward scrutiny was a tiny grain of sand added to a growing pile that would eventually become a mountain of inconvenience. The beauty of it was that Mark would never know who was behind it. He would simply experience a sudden, inexplicable surge in bureaucratic hurdles, an unusual number of inquiries, and a subtle shift in the way he was perceived by those around him. The emotional detachment I had cultivated was crucial. This wasn't about anger or vengeance in the traditional sense. It was about applying pressure, consistently and legally, until the cumulative effect became unbearable. I imagined him sitting at his desk, sifting through yet another official letter, or taking another call from a concerned board member, or dealing with another municipal inspector, and feeling a growing sense of unease, a creeping suspicion that something was amiss, but never being able to pinpoint the source. That quiet, internal chaos was the only form of justice I sought. I understood that this process would be slow, perhaps agonizingly so. But I had time. Alex's pain had been a constant for years. My resolve was equally enduring. This was not a quick fix, but a deliberate, strategic dismantling. Every piece of information I gathered, every inquiry I sent, every subtle suggestion I made, was a step towards making his life a mirror of the quiet, persistent disruption he had inflicted upon Alex. The goal was to ensure that his prosperity, built on the ashes of Alex's well-being, would slowly but surely crumble under the weight of entirely legal, yet profoundly disruptive, consequences. The next phase of my plan involved leveraging the power of public information and transparency laws. Many government agencies, from local planning departments to state-level regulatory bodies, are subject to Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests or their state-level equivalents. These laws allow citizens to request access to public records, including permits, licenses, inspection reports, and official communications. My goal was not to expose anything new, but to make existing, publicly available information more visible and, crucially, to force Mark's entities to respond to these requests, thereby consuming their time and resources. I began submitting FOIA requests for a wide range of documents related to Mark's business and properties. These requests were meticulously crafted to be broad enough to yield a significant volume of documents, yet specific enough to be legally valid. For example, I might request all inspection reports for Mark's business address from start date to end date, or all correspondence between Mark's company name and specific regulatory agency regarding specific type of permit or license. Each request, even if it ultimately yielded no incriminating information, required the agency to spend time locating, redacting, if necessary, and releasing the documents. And it required Mark's legal team to monitor these requests, to ensure no sensitive information was inadvertently released, and to potentially intervene if they felt the requests were overly burdensome or invasive. The beauty of FOIA requests is that they are entirely legal and often require a response within a specific time frame. Even if the documents released were innocuous, the process itself was a burden. It forced Mark and his team to dedicate resources to compliance, diverting their attention from revenue-generating activities. It was a subtle form of legal harassment, but harassment nonetheless, operating entirely within the bounds of the law. I varied the agencies, the types of requests, and the timing, ensuring a continuous, unpredictable stream of administrative demands. I also began to explore the world of open data initiatives. Many cities and states now publish vast amounts of public data online, from property records to business registrations to campaign finance disclosures. While this information was already public, it was often scattered, difficult to find, and not easily digestible. My task was to aggregate this data, to connect the dots that might not be immediately obvious to the casual observer. I built databases, cross-referencing Mark's name and his business entities across various public datasets. This allowed me to identify patterns, anomalies, or potential areas of non-compliance that might have gone unnoticed. For example, I might discover that a property owned by Mark had a history of multiple minor code violations that were eventually resolved, but the pattern itself could be indicative of a certain approach to maintenance or compliance. Or I might find that his company had received a disproportionate number of customer complaints compared to similar businesses in the same period, even if those complaints never escalated to formal legal action. This aggregated data, while not directly actionable in a legal sense, provided a deeper understanding of his operational vulnerabilities and could inform future, more targeted inquiries. My goal was to create a constant, low-level hum of administrative activity around Mark. Every time his company received a notice of a FOIA request, or his lawyers had to respond to an inquiry from a regulatory body, or he had to deal with a minor municipal inspection, it chipped away at his time, his peace of mind, and his financial resources. These were not direct attacks, but rather the systematic application of pressure through legitimate channels. It was about making his life incrementally more difficult, more complicated, and less profitable. The psychological impact was also a key consideration. While Mark would never know who was behind this relentless stream of inquiries, he would undoubtedly feel the pressure. He would wonder why his company was suddenly subject to so much scrutiny, why seemingly minor issues were being elevated, why his various affiliations were suddenly asking more pointed questions. This uncertainty, this nagging suspicion, would be a constant source of stress, eroding his confidence and diverting his focus. I was building a reputation for him, not through slander, but through the sheer volume of legitimate inquiries and the resulting administrative burden. The perception would shift from Mark is a successful businessman to Mark's business seems to attract a lot of regulatory attention, or Mark's properties seem to have a lot of minor issues. This subtle shift in perception, driven by entirely legal means, was a powerful weapon. It was a slow burn, but I was prepared for the long haul. My resolve was unwavering, fueled by the memory of Alex's pain and the system's failure. This was my form of justice, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. The financial aspect of Mark's life became my next area of intense, legal scrutiny. While I couldn't directly access his personal bank accounts or private financial statements, I could leverage publicly available financial data and the regulatory frameworks governing financial transactions. My goal was to create financial friction for him, to make his business dealings more cumbersome, and to potentially impact his creditworthiness or access to capital, all through perfectly legal means. I started by examining his company's public filings, particularly if it was a registered corporation or LLC. Many jurisdictions require businesses to file annual reports, which often include basic financial information, registered agents, and sometimes even lists of officers or directors. I would then cross-reference this information with other public databases, such as property records, to get a broader picture of his assets and liabilities. This wasn't about finding illegal activity, but about understanding the financial architecture of his prosperity. Next, I delved into the world of commercial credit reporting. Businesses, like individuals, have credit scores and reports. While I couldn't directly access these, I could understand the factors that influence them. Things like late payments to suppliers, unresolved disputes with vendors, or even a high volume of minor legal inquiries could negatively impact a business's credit standing. My previous activities, the regulatory inquiries, the FOIA requests, the subtle nudges to consumer protection agencies, were already contributing to this. Each time Mark's company had to respond to an inquiry, or deal with a minor fine, or resolve a small dispute, it created a paper trail that could, over time, affect his commercial credit profile. I also explored the legal mechanisms for challenging business practices related to invoicing or payment terms. If Mark's company had a reputation for being slow to pay vendors, or for having convoluted payment processes, I would anonymously inquire with relevant industry associations or even government contracting offices about best practices and legal requirements for timely payments. Again, this wasn't about making accusations, but about raising awareness and potentially prompting stricter enforcement of existing regulations. The goal was to make his financial interactions more transparent, more compliant, and therefore, potentially more costly and time-consuming for him. Another avenue I explored was the concept of nuisance lawsuits, not actual lawsuits initiated by me, but rather the strategic encouragement of others to pursue legitimate, albeit minor, claims against Mark's business. For instance, if I came across a pattern of unaddressed customer service issues, I might subtly suggest to the affected customers, again, anonymously, perhaps through public forums or online review sites, that they explore small claims court options for their grievances. Small claims court cases, even if they involve small sums, are a drain on time and resources for any business owner. They require appearances, documentation, and can lead to judgments that affect credit scores. My role was merely to provide information and encouragement, never to directly instigate or fund such actions. I also researched the various forms of business insurance Mark's company likely held: general liability, professional indemnity, directors' and officers' insurance. I learned about the conditions under which claims could be made against these policies, and how a history of frequent, even minor, claims could lead to increased premiums or even difficulty securing future coverage. While I couldn't directly influence his insurance rates, the cumulative effect of the various inquiries and minor disputes I was orchestrating could, over time, make his business appear riskier to insurers. The objective was to make his financial life less smooth, less predictable, and more expensive. Every additional hour his accountant spent responding to an inquiry, every minor legal fee incurred to address a regulatory issue, every small claims court appearance, these were all direct costs that chipped away at his bottom line. It was a slow bleed, designed to erode his financial stability without ever crossing the line into illegal interference or direct financial attack. This phase required an even greater degree of precision and understanding of legal and financial frameworks. It was about leveraging the existing system to create friction, to expose vulnerabilities, and to make Mark's prosperity less secure. The satisfaction wasn't in seeing him immediately suffer, but in knowing that with each carefully placed legal maneuver, his carefully constructed world was becoming a little less stable, a little more complicated, and a little more costly. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering fueled my relentless pursuit of this unconventional, yet entirely legal, form of justice. My campaign of disruption extended beyond just Mark's business and public affiliations. It began to subtly touch upon his professional reputation within his industry. Professionals often rely on referrals, networking, and a clean public image within their specific field. My goal was to introduce a subtle, persistent element of doubt and scrutiny into these professional circles, entirely through legal and ethical means. I started by researching industry-specific forums, professional organizations, and trade publications that Mark or his company were involved with. These platforms often have codes of conduct, ethical guidelines, and peer review processes. My approach was not to directly accuse Mark of anything, but to raise general questions about ethical standards, accountability, and best practices within the industry, subtly hinting at the importance of due diligence when forming partnerships or offering endorsements. For example, if a professional organization was discussing a new ethical guideline, I might, as an anonymous industry observer, submit a comment or question emphasizing the importance of rigorous background checks for members, or the need for transparency regarding any past disputes or ethical concerns, even if they didn't result in formal legal action. These comments were always framed as general concerns for the integrity of the profession, but they were designed to resonate with anyone who might have even a whisper of a doubt about Mark. I also paid close attention to any awards, accolades, or public speaking engagements Mark was involved in. These events often have nomination processes, selection committees, or vetting procedures. My strategy here was to submit anonymous, well-researched inquiries to the organizers or committees, not to accuse Mark, but to ask about the criteria for selection, the thoroughness of their vetting process, and their policies regarding individuals who might have unresolved ethical questions, again, without specifics. These inquiries, while seemingly innocuous, could prompt the organizers to conduct a more thorough review, potentially making Mark's participation or recognition less straightforward. The cumulative effect of these actions was to introduce a low-level static into his professional network. Colleagues might hear whispers, or notice a sudden increase in scrutiny around Mark's activities, or find themselves having to answer more pointed questions about his past or his business practices. This wouldn't lead to immediate ostracization, but it could make him a less desirable partner, a less trusted colleague, or a less attractive candidate for future opportunities. The goal was to make his professional life incrementally more challenging, to erode the effortless flow of opportunities he had previously enjoyed. Furthermore, I explored the concept of reputational risk in the context of his business partners and clients. Many companies, especially larger ones, are highly sensitive to negative publicity or association with individuals who might pose a reputational risk. While I couldn't directly contact his partners or clients with accusations, I could ensure that any public information I had legally unearthed, e.g., minor regulatory issues, customer complaints, FOIA requests, was easily discoverable by them if they conducted their own due diligence. This was about making the noise around Mark loud enough that it would eventually reach the ears of those who valued their own reputation above all else. This required a deep understanding of how information flows within specific industries and professional communities. It was about planting seeds of doubt in fertile ground, allowing the natural processes of professional scrutiny and risk assessment to take their course. I was not spreading rumors. I was facilitating the discovery of existing, legally obtained information and encouraging legitimate inquiry. The emotional toll of this relentless, anonymous pressure would be significant. Mark, accustomed to effortless success and an unblemished public image, would likely find himself increasingly perplexed and frustrated by the subtle yet persistent challenges to his standing. He would likely struggle to identify the source of this disruption, leading to paranoia and a constant state of vigilance. This psychological burden, inflicted entirely through legal and ethical means, was a key component of my strategy. I envisioned a future where Mark, despite his outward prosperity, would find himself constantly battling unseen forces, perpetually defending against minor inquiries, and struggling to maintain the pristine image he had so carefully cultivated. This was not about a single, dramatic downfall, but a slow, methodical erosion of his peace, his time, and his professional standing. It was a long game, but every step, every legal maneuver, brought me closer to the unconventional justice I sought for Alex. My resolve remained unshakable, fueled by the quiet determination to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present. As the layers of my strategy deepened, I began to consider the broader ecosystem in which Mark operated, his suppliers, his service providers, even the local media. My aim was to introduce a subtle, legal element of risk or inconvenience into these relationships, without ever resorting to illegal interference or defamation. For his suppliers and vendors, I focused on the concept of due diligence. Many businesses, especially those with established reputations, conduct periodic reviews of their partners to ensure they align with their own ethical standards and operational efficiency. My approach was to ensure that any publicly available information I had gathered, such as minor regulatory issues, customer complaints, or even a pattern of FOIA requests related to Mark's business, was easily discoverable by these suppliers if they performed such a review. I wouldn't directly contact them, but I would ensure that this information was indexed and discoverable through legitimate search queries, perhaps by ensuring that relevant public records were linked or referenced in online discussions where appropriate. The goal was to make Mark's business appear as a slightly higher risk, a client that might require more oversight or might inadvertently draw unwanted attention. Similarly, with his service providers, his accountants, his marketing agencies, his IT support, I considered how to legally introduce friction. These professionals often rely on a smooth, uncomplicated relationship with their clients. If Mark's business suddenly became a magnet for regulatory inquiries, or if his financial dealings became subject to more public scrutiny, it could make him a less desirable client. Accountants might find themselves spending more time responding to obscure inquiries. Marketing agencies might become wary of promoting a brand that seemed to attract negative attention, and IT support might deal with an increased volume of security concerns related to public data requests. This wasn't about cutting off his services, but about making them incrementally more complex and potentially more expensive for him. The local media was another subtle, yet powerful, lever. I had no intention of feeding them false information or making direct accusations. Instead, I focused on public interest stories related to his industry or local business trends. For example, if there was a local news story about consumer rights or regulatory oversight in his sector, I might, as an anonymous concerned citizen, submit a tip or an email to the reporter, not about Mark directly, but about the general importance of rigorous enforcement or the need for transparency in certain business practices. I might subtly point to publicly available data, like aggregated customer complaints or FOIA request outcomes, that illustrated a broader trend without ever naming Mark. The hope was that a diligent reporter, following up on a general trend, might independently stumble upon the patterns of scrutiny I had created around Mark's business. This was about creating an environment where Mark's operations were under a perpetual, low-level microscope, not because of illegal activity, but because of a relentless, legal application of existing transparency and regulatory mechanisms. It was about making his life a continuous exercise in damage control and administrative burden. He would be constantly responding to inquiries, defending against minor challenges, and dealing with a subtle erosion of trust from those around him. The psychological impact of this constant, unseen pressure was a significant part of my strategy. Mark, who had likely grown accustomed to operating with a sense of invincibility, would find himself increasingly paranoid. He would search for a visible enemy, a direct antagonist, but find none. The source of his discomfort would be diffuse, seemingly random, and impossible to directly confront. This uncertainty, this inability to identify and neutralize the threat, would be a potent weapon against his peace of mind. I maintained my emotional detachment throughout this process. This was not about personal gratification in the moment, but about the methodical execution of a long-term strategy. Each legal step, each anonymous inquiry, each subtle manipulation of public information was a calculated move towards a singular objective: to ensure that Mark's prosperity, built on the silence and suffering of Alex, would slowly but surely become a source of constant, legal, and profound inconvenience. The justice system had failed, but I was determined to create a parallel system of consequences, one where the weight of legitimate scrutiny would eventually become unbearable. My resolve remained absolute. My focus then shifted to the digital footprint of Mark and his various entities. In the modern age, online presence is paramount for reputation and business success. While I would never engage in illegal hacking or direct cyber attacks, I could leverage publicly available information and the legitimate functions of online platforms to create legal, yet disruptive, friction. I began by meticulously reviewing all of Mark's and his company's online profiles, professional networking sites, business directories, social media accounts, and even obscure industry-specific forums. I wasn't looking for scandalous posts, but for inconsistencies, outdated information, or any claims that could be technically challenged through the platform's own reporting mechanisms. For example, if a business directory listed an outdated address or phone number, I would submit a correction request, forcing them to verify the information with Mark's company. If a professional profile made a claim about a certification that was no longer current, I would flag it as potentially misleading, prompting the platform to investigate. These were minor administrative tasks for the platforms, but they translated into time-consuming verification processes for Mark. I also paid close attention to the terms of service and community guidelines of these platforms. Many platforms have rules against misleading information, spam, or even overly aggressive marketing tactics. While Mark might not be engaging in outright violations, I could look for subtle ways his online presence might skirt the edges of these rules. For instance, if his company had multiple, slightly varied listings across different directories, I might report them as potential duplicates, forcing a consolidation or verification process. This wasn't about getting him banned, but about creating a constant need for him to review, update, and defend his online presence. Another avenue involved search engine optimization, SEO, and online discoverability. While I couldn't directly manipulate search results, I could ensure that the publicly available information I had legally gathered, such as news articles about minor regulatory issues or discussions on public forums about customer complaints, was optimized for discoverability. This involved ensuring that these legitimate, public pieces of information were accurately tagged and linked, making them more likely to appear in search results when someone researched Mark or his business. This wasn't about doxing or publishing private information. It was about ensuring that existing public data was easily accessible to anyone performing due diligence. I also explored the concept of digital hygiene and how a lack thereof could be leveraged. Many businesses, especially smaller ones, might have old, unmonitored websites or social media accounts that contain outdated information or even security vulnerabilities. While I would never exploit these vulnerabilities, I could anonymously report them to the relevant platform or security service, prompting them to notify Mark and require him to address the issues. This would create additional IT and administrative burdens for him, forcing him to dedicate resources to maintaining a secure and accurate online presence. The cumulative effect of these digital maneuvers was to create a constant, low-level hum of online administrative work for Mark. He would find himself constantly updating profiles, responding to verification requests, and ensuring his online presence was meticulously accurate and compliant. This would be a continuous drain on his time and resources, a subtle but persistent form of digital friction. The psychological impact of this digital disruption was significant. In today's interconnected world, an online presence is often a reflection of one's professional identity. To have that presence constantly scrutinized, challenged, and require endless maintenance would be deeply unsettling. Mark, who likely prided himself on his polished online image, would find it increasingly difficult to maintain that facade without constant effort. He would be forced to dedicate valuable time to managing his digital footprint, time that could otherwise be spent on growing his business or enjoying his prosperity. My resolve remained unyielding. This was a war of attrition, fought on multiple fronts, with every legal tool at my disposal. The digital realm, with its vast interconnectedness and reliance on public information, offered yet another powerful avenue for creating the kind of persistent, legal inconvenience that would slowly but surely erode Mark's peace and prosperity. The memory of Alex's suffering fueled my determination to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. As my strategy matured, I began to think beyond direct actions and consider the power of indirect influence and the subtle manipulation of perception. This involved understanding the psychology of decision-making within organizations and how a pattern of minor, legitimate issues could cumulatively create a sense of unease or risk without any explicit accusations. My focus shifted to the concept of audit fatigue. If Mark's business was consistently receiving inquiries from various regulatory bodies, even for minor issues, it would eventually trigger an internal review or a greater degree of scrutiny from his own legal and accounting teams. No business wants to be seen as a problem client by its own professional advisors. While I couldn't directly influence these internal dynamics, the sheer volume of legitimate inquiries I was generating would inevitably lead to increased internal costs for Mark, more hours billed by his lawyers, more time spent by his accountants, more internal resources dedicated to compliance and response. This was a form of financial drain that was entirely self-inflicted, a direct consequence of the administrative burden I was creating. I also began to explore the concept of reputational contagion. If Mark's business was consistently associated with minor controversies or regulatory issues, even if resolved, it could make his business partners and clients wary. Large corporations, in particular, are highly sensitive to anything that could tarnish their brand image. While I wouldn't directly contact them with accusations, I would ensure that any public information related to Mark's minor issues was easily discoverable through legitimate search queries and public records. If a potential partner conducted due diligence and found a recurring pattern of regulatory inquiries or customer complaints, even if minor, it could make them reconsider their association with Mark, deeming him a potential reputational risk. This required a nuanced understanding of how information, even seemingly innocuous information, could be interpreted within a professional context. It wasn't about making Mark look like a criminal, but about making him look like a persistent administrative headache, a business that required disproportionate oversight, or a partner that carried an unspoken, subtle risk. This perception, cultivated through entirely legal means, could slowly but surely erode his network and his access to new opportunities. I also considered the psychological impact on Mark himself. The constant, low-level pressure, the inability to identify a direct antagonist, and the feeling that his life was becoming increasingly complicated and scrutinized would inevitably take a toll. He would likely experience increased stress, paranoia, and a sense of being constantly under siege. This psychological burden, inflicted entirely through legal and ethical means, was a key component of my strategy. It was about making his carefully constructed world feel less secure, less predictable, and ultimately, less enjoyable. My actions were always carefully calibrated to remain within the bounds of the law. I was not engaging in harassment, stalking, or any form of illegal interference. I was simply exercising my rights as a citizen to access public information, to submit inquiries to regulatory bodies, and to encourage the proper functioning of existing systems. The genius of this approach lay in its legality and its deniability. Mark would have no legal recourse against me, as I was merely acting as a concerned citizen, a diligent researcher, or an anonymous tipster, always within the established frameworks. This phase of the plan was about the long game, about the cumulative effect of seemingly minor actions. It was about creating a slow, inexorable squeeze on Mark's life, making his prosperity less comfortable and his future less secure. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering resolve. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. The next layer of my strategy involved a deeper dive into the specific legal and ethical obligations of professionals within Mark's sphere of influence. This wasn't about finding their misdeeds, but about understanding how their own professional codes and licensing requirements could be leveraged to increase scrutiny on Mark, without directly involving them in my personal vendetta. I researched the professional associations and licensing boards for his lawyers, accountants, and other key service providers. These bodies often have strict rules regarding client due diligence, ethical conduct, and reporting obligations. While I couldn't directly compel them to drop Mark as a client, I could, through anonymous inquiries, subtly raise questions that might prompt them to review their own internal processes or their client relationships. For example, I might send an anonymous letter to a state bar association, not about Mark's lawyer specifically, but about the general ethical obligations of attorneys when representing clients with a history of certain types of allegations, again, without naming Mark or the specific incident. The letter would be phrased as a general concern for the integrity of the legal profession, perhaps referencing a hypothetical scenario that mirrored aspects of Mark's past. This could prompt the Bar Association to issue a general advisory, or to subtly remind attorneys of their ethical duties, which might, in turn, lead Mark's legal counsel to conduct a more thorough internal review of their representation. Similarly, for his accountants, I might inquire with their professional licensing body about the standards of due diligence required when preparing financial statements for clients whose businesses are subject to frequent regulatory inquiries. This wasn't an accusation against the accountant, but a general question designed to make them more cautious and perhaps more demanding of Mark regarding his financial transparency and compliance. The goal was to make Mark a higher maintenance client, increasing the professional risk and administrative burden for those who served him. This approach was incredibly subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was designed to create a ripple effect. If Mark's professional advisors began to feel that representing him carried an increased risk of scrutiny from their own licensing bodies, or that his business was simply becoming too much of a headache, it could lead to a natural, legal distancing. They might raise their fees, demand more documentation, or even, in extreme cases, decide to terminate their professional relationship, citing business reasons or resource allocation. I also considered the potential for whistleblower mechanisms within his industry or even within his own company, should such opportunities arise. While I would never encourage illegal activity or provide false information, I would meticulously monitor public forums and news for any signs of internal discontent or ethical concerns within Mark's sphere. If a legitimate whistleblower emerged, I would ensure that any publicly available information I had gathered that supported their claims was easily discoverable without ever directly interacting with the whistleblower. This was about providing legitimate, verifiable context to any emerging narratives, allowing the truth to surface through existing legal channels. The psychological impact on Mark would be profound. Not only would he be dealing with external pressures, but he would also face potential internal friction from his own trusted advisors. The feeling that even his closest professional allies were becoming wary, or that his business was becoming a liability for them, would be deeply unsettling. He would find his circle of trust shrinking, his options narrowing, and his once effortless path to prosperity becoming increasingly fraught with obstacles. My actions remained strictly within legal boundaries, always leveraging existing laws, regulations, and professional codes of conduct. This was not about illegal interference, but about the relentless, legal application of pressure designed to make Mark's life a continuous, low-grade nightmare. The memory of Alex's pain and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering resolve. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. My strategy began to incorporate the concept of information asymmetry, the idea that one party in a transaction or relationship has more or better information than the other. Mark had long benefited from information asymmetry, with Alex and our family being in the dark about the full truth for years. Now, I would turn this on him, not by revealing secrets, but by ensuring that all publicly available, legitimate information about him and his business was easily accessible and comprehensible to anyone who sought it. I started by creating a comprehensive, organized digital archive of all the public records, news articles, regulatory inquiries, and online discussions I had legally gathered about Mark and his entities. This wasn't a website or a public expose, but a private, meticulously cross-referenced database. The goal was to have all relevant information at my fingertips, allowing me to quickly identify patterns or connections that might not be obvious to others. This internal resource allowed me to be incredibly efficient and precise in my actions. Next, I focused on making this information discoverable by the right people without directly disseminating it myself. This involved understanding how different groups conduct due diligence. For instance, if a local newspaper was doing a story on business ethics, I might anonymously submit a tip suggesting they look into the public records of businesses with a high volume of minor regulatory inquiries in a specific sector without naming Mark. A diligent reporter, following this lead, might then independently discover the patterns I had meticulously created around Mark's business. Similarly, if a potential investor or business partner was researching Mark, I wanted to ensure that their legitimate search queries would easily lead them to the public information I had cultivated. This involved ensuring that the public records were accurately tagged and indexed, and that any legitimate online discussions referencing these records were visible. This wasn't about doxing or publishing private information. It was about optimizing the discoverability of existing public data. The goal was to ensure that anyone doing their homework on Mark would find a consistent, albeit subtle, pattern of administrative friction and scrutiny. I also considered the power of network effects in information dissemination. If I could subtly encourage one person or entity to conduct legitimate scrutiny, their findings, if public, could then influence others in their network. For example, if a local community board, prompted by my anonymous inquiry, decided to conduct a more thorough review of Mark's involvement, their findings, if public, could then be picked up by other community groups or even local media, creating a cascading effect of legitimate scrutiny. This phase was about being a silent conductor, orchestrating a symphony of legal inquiries and public information flow, all designed to create a cumulative effect of inconvenience and erosion for Mark. He would find himself constantly reacting to external pressures, but never able to pinpoint the source. The psychological toll of this constant, unseen pressure would be immense. He would be living in a world where seemingly random events conspired to make his life more difficult, more scrutinized, and less profitable. My actions remained strictly within legal boundaries. I was not engaging in illegal hacking, defamation, or any form of illegal interference. I was simply exercising my rights as a citizen to access public information, to submit inquiries to regulatory bodies, and to encourage the proper functioning of existing systems. The genius of this approach lay in its legality and its deniability. Mark would have no legal recourse against me, as I was merely acting as a concerned citizen, a diligent researcher, or an anonymous tipster, always within the established frameworks. This was a long-term commitment, a slow burn designed to erode Mark's prosperity and peace of mind. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering resolve. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. The concept of weaponized bureaucracy became a central tenet of my strategy. I had come to understand that the sheer weight of administrative processes, even when perfectly legitimate, could be a devastating tool. My goal was to immerse Mark in a perpetual swamp of paperwork, inquiries, and compliance demands, all initiated through legal channels, making his life a constant battle against the system itself. I began to identify every conceivable permit, license, or registration that Mark's business or properties might require, no matter how obscure or seemingly insignificant. Then, I would anonymously inquire with the relevant government agencies about the renewal dates, compliance requirements, and potential penalties for even minor infractions. This wasn't about reporting him for violations, but about ensuring that the agencies were rigorously enforcing every single rule, no matter how small. For example, if a local ordinance required a specific type of sign permit, I would inquire about the exact dimensions, placement rules, and inspection schedules, subtly prompting the agency to pay closer attention to all businesses, including Mark's. This also extended to environmental regulations. Even small businesses have environmental responsibilities, from waste disposal to energy efficiency. I would research the specific environmental regulations applicable to Mark's industry and location, then anonymously submit inquiries to environmental protection agencies about their enforcement protocols, perhaps citing hypothetical scenarios that mirrored aspects of Mark's operations. This could lead to increased scrutiny of his waste management practices, energy consumption, or even minor emissions, triggering audits or requiring him to invest in new compliance measures. The cumulative effect of these bureaucratic maneuvers was designed to create a constant state of compliance anxiety for Mark. He would find himself perpetually reviewing his permits, double-checking his registrations, and ensuring every minor detail of his operations met the most stringent interpretation of the law. This consumed vast amounts of his time, his staff's time, and his financial resources, as he would likely need to consult lawyers and consultants to navigate this bureaucratic labyrinth. I also explored the use of public comment periods for proposed regulations or zoning changes. Many government bodies allow public input on new rules. I would anonymously submit comments, always framed as general concerns for public welfare or good governance, but often subtly highlighting aspects that, if adopted, would create additional compliance burdens for businesses like Mark's. For instance, I might advocate for stricter noise ordinances or more stringent building codes in a way that would disproportionately affect his commercial properties or operational hours. This was a slow, methodical process, a drip of administrative pressure. Each inquiry, each subtle nudge to a regulatory body, each public comment, was a tiny stone added to a growing pile that would eventually crush his peace of mind and his bottom line. The beauty of it was that it was all perfectly legal. Mark could not sue me for asking a government agency to do its job or for submitting a public comment. He could only react, defend, and comply. The psychological impact of this weaponized bureaucracy was profound. Mark, accustomed to operating with a degree of impunity, would find himself constantly battling an invisible enemy, the system itself. He would struggle to understand why his business was suddenly subject to such intense and relentless scrutiny, why every minor detail of his operations was being questioned. This uncertainty, this feeling of being constantly under the microscope, would be a relentless source of stress, eroding his confidence and diverting his focus from productive endeavors. My resolve remained absolute. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering commitment. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. My strategy evolved to incorporate the subtle manipulation of public perception through the lens of community interest. Mark, like many successful individuals, cultivated an image of being a pillar of the community, a responsible business owner, and a benevolent figure. My aim was to legally and ethically challenge this perception, not through direct attacks, but by subtly highlighting discrepancies between his public image and the realities of his operations, as revealed through public records. I began by identifying local community groups, neighborhood associations, and citizen advocacy organizations that focused on issues like local development, environmental protection, consumer rights, or business ethics. My approach was to anonymously provide these groups with publicly available information that, while not directly incriminating, might raise questions about Mark's commitment to community welfare or his adherence to best practices. For example, if a neighborhood association was concerned about noise levels from local businesses, I might, as an anonymous resident, point them towards publicly available information about Mark's business operating hours or any minor noise complaints that had been filed and resolved, or not fully resolved, through municipal channels. I wouldn't make an accusation, but I would provide the data and let the community group draw its own conclusions and pursue its own legitimate inquiries. Similarly, if an environmental group was advocating for stricter local environmental standards, I might anonymously share publicly available data related to Mark's business's waste disposal practices or energy consumption, again, without making any direct claims of wrongdoing. The goal was to empower these legitimate community organizations with information that would allow them to independently scrutinize Mark's operations through their own advocacy efforts. This would create a new layer of pressure for Mark, as he would find himself having to respond not just to government agencies, but to engaged and vocal community groups. I also paid close attention to local media coverage of community issues. If a reporter was covering a story about local business impact on quality of life, I might anonymously submit a tip suggesting they look into the public records of businesses that had generated a certain number of minor, resolved complaints, or those that had a history of numerous, albeit minor, regulatory inquiries. This was about guiding legitimate journalistic inquiry towards Mark's sphere of influence, allowing the media to independently uncover the patterns of scrutiny I had created. The cumulative effect of these actions was to subtly shift Mark's public image from an unblemished community leader to a business owner who, while perhaps not breaking laws, consistently attracted scrutiny and generated minor issues. This perception, cultivated through entirely legal and ethical means, could erode the goodwill he had built and make him a less desirable figure for community partnerships, endorsements, or leadership roles. The psychological impact on Mark would be significant. He had likely invested heavily in cultivating his public image, viewing it as a shield against his past. To see that image slowly tarnishing, not through direct attack but through the relentless accumulation of minor, legitimate inquiries and community scrutiny, would be deeply unsettling. He would find himself constantly defending against a diffuse and intangible threat, unable to identify a direct antagonist or a clear path to resolution. This constant, low-level anxiety would be a persistent drain on his mental and emotional resources. My actions remained strictly within legal boundaries, always leveraging existing laws, regulations, and public information. I was not engaging in defamation, harassment, or any form of illegal interference. I was simply exercising my rights as a citizen to access public information, to submit inquiries to regulatory bodies, and to encourage the proper functioning of existing systems and community advocacy. The genius of this approach lay in its legality and its deniability. Mark would have no legal recourse against me, as I was merely acting as a concerned citizen, a diligent researcher, or an anonymous tipster, always within the established frameworks. This was a long-term commitment, a slow burn designed to erode Mark's prosperity and peace of mind. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering resolve. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. My strategy moved into a phase of leveraging the sheer volume of legitimate, publicly available data to create a sense of overwhelming scrutiny. The goal was to make Mark's life a constant exercise in responding to inquiries, defending against minor challenges, and navigating a bureaucratic maze, all while remaining entirely within the bounds of the law. I began to systematically track every single public record, inquiry, or minor issue I had generated or influenced regarding Mark and his entities. This wasn't just about collecting data, it was about analyzing the patterns of response, identifying which agencies or types of inquiries elicited the most significant administrative burden for him. This allowed me to refine my approach, focusing on the most effective legal levers. For instance, if a particular type of permit inquiry consistently led to a lengthy review process for his business, I would replicate that type of inquiry across different, but related, aspects of his operations. I also explored the concept of information overload for Mark. While he might be able to easily dismiss one or two minor inquiries, a constant, unpredictable barrage of them would be far more difficult to manage. I varied the source of the inquiries, different agencies, different types of public records requests, different community groups, the timing, and the specific focus, ensuring that he could never anticipate the next point of pressure. This created a sense of perpetual vigilance and uncertainty for him. Furthermore, I began to subtly cross-reference information across different public domains. For example, if a minor zoning variance was granted for one of his properties, I would then check if that variance had any implications for his business licensing or environmental compliance. This wasn't about finding new violations, but about ensuring that every single aspect of his public life was meticulously scrutinized and that any interdependencies between different regulatory areas were brought to light. This created a complex web of interconnected scrutiny, where a minor issue in one area could trigger a review in another, multiplying the administrative burden. The cumulative effect of this relentless, legal pressure was designed to make Mark's life feel like a constant battle against an unseen force. He would be perpetually on the defensive, spending valuable time and resources responding to inquiries, defending his practices, and ensuring compliance with an ever-increasing array of regulations. This would not only drain his financial resources but also his mental and emotional energy, leaving him with less time and capacity for his core business or personal pursuits. The psychological impact of this sustained pressure was paramount. Mark, accustomed to effortless success, would find himself constantly perplexed and frustrated. He would search for a direct enemy, a clear source of his woes, but find none. The pressure would feel diffuse, systemic, and inescapable. This uncertainty, this inability to identify and neutralize the threat, would be a potent weapon against his peace of mind, leading to paranoia and a constant state of anxiety. My actions remained strictly within legal boundaries, always leveraging existing laws, regulations, and public information. I was not engaging in illegal hacking, defamation, or any form of illegal interference. I was simply exercising my rights as a citizen to access public information, to submit inquiries to regulatory bodies, and to encourage the proper functioning of existing systems. The genius of this approach lay in its legality and its deniability. Mark would have no legal recourse against me, as I was merely acting as a concerned citizen, a diligent researcher, or an anonymous tipster, always within the established frameworks. This was a long-term commitment, a slow burn designed to erode Mark's prosperity and peace of mind. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering resolve. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. My strategy entered a phase of sustained, low-level pressure, designed to be a constant, unignorable hum in Mark's life. This wasn't about dramatic, one-off events, but about creating a persistent, pervasive sense of administrative burden and scrutiny that would slowly but surely erode his peace of mind and his prosperity. The goal was to make his life incrementally more difficult, more complicated, and less enjoyable, all through perfectly legal means. I established a routine for my activities, ensuring a consistent flow of inquiries and information dissemination. This involved setting up alerts for any new public filings or news related to Mark or his business. I would regularly review industry news and local government agendas for opportunities to submit anonymous comments or inquiries that, while general in nature, would subtly direct attention towards the kind of issues Mark's business might face. This ensured that the pressure was not sporadic, but a continuous, low-grade force. I also began to explore the concept of regulatory creep, how minor changes in regulations or interpretations of existing laws could be leveraged. If a new interpretation of a building code was introduced, for instance, I would anonymously inquire with the relevant department about its implications for businesses with older properties, subtly hinting at the need for retroactive compliance or stricter enforcement. This could force Mark to make unexpected investments in his properties to meet new standards, adding to his financial burden. Furthermore, I continued to refine my methods for making publicly available information easily discoverable. This involved creating more sophisticated internal databases, cross-referencing Mark's name and his business entities across an even wider array of public datasets. I also learned to leverage the nuances of search engine algorithms, ensuring that legitimate news articles, public records, and forum discussions related to Mark's minor issues were highly visible to anyone conducting due diligence on him. This wasn't about manipulating search results, but about optimizing the discoverability of existing, legitimate public information. The cumulative effect of this sustained pressure was designed to create a sense of weariness for Mark. He would be constantly responding to inquiries, defending against minor challenges, and navigating a bureaucratic maze. This would not only drain his financial resources but also his mental and emotional energy, leaving him with less time and capacity for his core business or personal pursuits. The seemingly random nature of the inquiries, combined with their relentless frequency, would prevent him from ever feeling truly secure or at peace. The psychological impact of this persistent, unseen pressure was paramount. Mark, accustomed to effortless success, would find himself constantly perplexed and frustrated. He would search for a direct enemy, a clear source of his woes, but find none. The pressure would feel diffuse, systemic, and inescapable. This uncertainty, this inability to identify and neutralize the threat, would be a potent weapon against his peace of mind, leading to paranoia and a constant state of anxiety. He would begin to question every decision, every interaction, wondering if it was somehow connected to the inexplicable surge in scrutiny. My actions remained strictly within legal boundaries, always leveraging existing laws, regulations, and public information. I was not engaging in illegal hacking, defamation, or any form of illegal interference. I was simply exercising my rights as a citizen to access public information, to submit inquiries to regulatory bodies, and to encourage the proper functioning of existing systems. The genius of this approach lay in its legality and its deniability. Mark would have no legal recourse against me, as I was merely acting as a concerned citizen, a diligent researcher, or an anonymous tipster, always within the established frameworks. This was a long-term commitment, a slow burn designed to erode Mark's prosperity and peace of mind. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering resolve. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. As the months turned into a year, and then beyond, my campaign of legal disruption became a finely tuned machine. I had moved past the initial learning curve and was now operating with a chilling efficiency, each action a calculated step in a much larger, insidious dance. The initial emotional intensity had long since transmuted into a cold, unwavering resolve, a detached focus on the mechanics of legal inconvenience. I began to anticipate Mark's reactions, understanding his likely responses to various types of inquiries. This allowed me to preempt his defenses, to craft my next moves in a way that would force him into even more time-consuming and resource-intensive responses. For instance, if a previous inquiry about a specific permit led him to quickly update it, my next inquiry might focus on the process of that update, or whether the updated permit fully complied with a newly interpreted, more stringent regulation. It was a game of perpetual motion, always keeping him on his toes. I also started to identify patterns in the responses from various government agencies. Some were more proactive in their investigations, others more bureaucratic. This allowed me to strategically target the agencies that would yield the most administrative burden for Mark, ensuring that my efforts were maximally effective. I learned which keywords in a FOIA request would trigger the broadest document search, and which phrasing in a public comment would prompt the most detailed review by a regulatory body. This was about mastering the art of legal leverage. The financial drain on Mark was becoming increasingly apparent, even if I couldn't see his balance sheets. The constant need for legal counsel, the time spent by his administrative staff on compliance, the potential for minor fines, and the general distraction from revenue-generating activities were all chipping away at his bottom line. I imagined him looking at his monthly expenses, seeing an inexplicable rise in legal and compliance fees, and feeling a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. The psychological impact was also deepening. The initial paranoia would likely have settled into a chronic state of anxiety. Mark would be constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering when the next inquiry would land on his desk, or what seemingly innocuous detail of his life would next be subjected to scrutiny. This perpetual state of unease would erode his ability to focus, to innovate, and to enjoy the fruits of his perceived success. His carefully constructed facade of invincibility would be cracking under the relentless, unseen pressure. I maintained my anonymity with absolute rigor. All communications were routed through secure, untraceable channels. My research was conducted on public networks, and my inquiries were always generic enough to avoid any direct link to Alex or our family. Mark would never know who was behind this relentless campaign, only that his life had inexplicably become a magnet for bureaucratic friction and public scrutiny. This lack of a discernible enemy would be one of the most potent weapons against his peace of mind. My resolve remained absolute. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering commitment. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. The long game was far from over, but every passing day brought him closer to the inevitable, slow unraveling of his carefully constructed world. The culmination of my efforts wasn't a single, dramatic event, but a slow, inexorable tightening of the legal and administrative noose around Mark. I began to see subtle shifts in his public presence, small indicators that my campaign was having its intended effect. His company's marketing materials became more cautious, less prone to grand claims. His public speaking engagements seemed to dwindle, or perhaps were subjected to greater scrutiny by organizers. There was a palpable sense of a man who was constantly on the defensive, even if the source of the defense remained invisible to him. I noticed that some of his minor business affiliations seemed to quietly dissolve, or new ones were not forming with the same ease as before. While I couldn't definitively attribute this to my actions, it was a strong indication that the cumulative effect of the inquiries, the heightened scrutiny, and the general noise around his operations was making him a less attractive partner. The reputational risk, however subtle, was beginning to outweigh the perceived benefits of association. His responses to the inquiries, when they were public, also became more terse, more legalistic, betraying a growing frustration. The initial dismissiveness had given way to a weary compliance, a clear sign that the administrative burden was taking its toll. The sheer volume of paperwork and legal consultations required to answer the constant stream of legitimate questions would be immense, draining his resources and his patience. I also observed a subtle change in the tone of online discussions related to his business. While there were no outright attacks, the conversations seemed to carry a more cautious undertone. People were asking more pointed questions, referencing public records, and discussing regulatory compliance in a way they hadn't before. This was the result of my efforts to make legitimate public information more discoverable and to subtly guide community scrutiny. The narrative around Mark was shifting, not through slander, but through the relentless exposure to perfectly legal, yet inconvenient, facts. The psychological impact on Mark, though unseen, was undoubtedly profound. He was a man who thrived on control and a carefully curated image. To have that control constantly challenged by unseen forces, to have his image subtly tarnished by a relentless stream of legitimate inquiries, would be a form of slow torture. He would be living in a state of perpetual vigilance, constantly wondering who was behind the scrutiny and what seemingly innocuous detail of his life would be targeted next. This paranoia, this inability to identify and confront his tormentor, would be a far more potent punishment than any legal judgment. My actions remained strictly within legal boundaries, always leveraging existing laws, regulations, and public information. I was not engaging in illegal hacking, defamation, or any form of illegal interference. I was simply exercising my rights as a citizen to access public information, to submit inquiries to regulatory bodies, and to encourage the proper functioning of existing systems. The genius of this approach lay in its legality and its deniability. Mark would have no legal recourse against me, as I was merely acting as a concerned citizen, a diligent researcher, or an anonymous tipster, always within the established frameworks. This was the long game, playing out precisely as intended. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering resolve. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. The unraveling was slow, but it was undeniable, a testament to the power of persistent, legal pressure. The beauty of my long-term strategy lay in its self-sustaining nature. Once a pattern of legitimate inquiries and heightened scrutiny was established around Mark, it began to generate its own momentum. Regulatory agencies, having received multiple inquiries, would naturally flag his business for closer attention. Community groups, once aware of certain public records, would continue their own advocacy. Even his professional peers, having seen the subtle shifts in his public profile, would begin to exercise greater caution. I was no longer merely initiating, I was also monitoring and subtly amplifying existing scrutiny. I continued to refine my methods, focusing on efficiency and impact. I automated parts of my information gathering process, setting up sophisticated alerts for new public filings or news mentions related to Mark. This allowed me to react quickly to any new development, ensuring that any new venture or public appearance by him was immediately subjected to the same rigorous, legal scrutiny. The goal was to ensure that no aspect of his life, public or professional, could escape the pervasive gaze of legitimate inquiry. The financial impact on Mark would be a slow bleed, not a sudden hemorrhage. His legal fees would remain consistently high, his administrative costs inflated by the need to respond to endless inquiries. He would likely face increased insurance premiums, higher interest rates on loans, or even difficulty securing new lines of credit as his business appeared riskier to financial institutions. These were the invisible costs of doing business under constant scrutiny, the price of his unpunished past finally catching up to him, not through a judge's gavel, but through the relentless grind of bureaucracy and risk assessment. The psychological toll on Mark would be the most profound form of justice. He was a man who thrived on external validation and the appearance of success. To have that foundation constantly undermined by unseen forces, To live with the perpetual anxiety of the next inquiry, the next subtle shift in public perception, would be a far more insidious punishment than any prison sentence. He would be trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, haunted by the knowledge that his past, though legally unpunished, was now a constant, disruptive presence in his life. He would likely become withdrawn, suspicious, and increasingly isolated as his carefully constructed network began to fray under the weight of his growing reputational burden. My resolve remained absolute. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering commitment. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. The unraveling was slow, but it was undeniable, a testament to the power of persistent, legal pressure. The silence that had once protected him was now replaced by the constant hum of legitimate scrutiny, a hum that would follow him wherever he went, a constant reminder of the consequences he could not outrun. This was my justice, delivered one legal inquiry at a time. The ultimate goal of this relentless, legal campaign was not to achieve a single, dramatic downfall, but to engineer a state of perpetual, low-grade ruin for Mark. I envisioned a future where his prosperity, while perhaps outwardly maintained, would be hollowed out from within by the constant drain of resources, the erosion of his reputation, and the crushing weight of psychological stress. This was not about revenge in the traditional sense, but about rebalancing the scales through a sustained application of legal friction. I began to consider the long-term implications of my actions, ensuring that the pressure remained consistent and adaptable. If Mark attempted to pivot his business or move to a new location, my established network of information gathering and legal inquiry would simply follow him. His past, now meticulously documented through public records and legitimate inquiries, would become an inescapable shadow, casting doubt on any new venture he pursued. There would be no escape, no clean slate, only the persistent hum of scrutiny. The financial impact would continue to compound. Increased operational costs due to compliance, higher legal fees, potential loss of lucrative contracts due to reputational concerns, and difficulty in securing favorable financing, these would all contribute to a slow but steady erosion of his wealth. He might find himself working harder, just to stay in the same place, constantly battling the invisible forces I had unleashed. The luxury and ease he had enjoyed would be replaced by a relentless grind, a constant struggle against the very systems he had once so easily navigated. The psychological toll would be the most profound and enduring consequence. Mark, a man who had built his life on a foundation of unpunished betrayal, would be forced to live with a constant sense of unease. The paranoia would deepen, the anxiety would become chronic. He would be perpetually looking for the source of his woes, but finding only the legitimate, systemic processes of bureaucracy and public scrutiny. This inability to identify and confront a direct enemy would be a form of psychological torture, leaving him isolated and increasingly desperate. His carefully constructed facade would crumble, not in a public spectacle, but in the quiet, agonizing privacy of his own mind. My resolve remained absolute. The memory of Alex's quiet suffering and the system's failure to deliver justice continued to fuel my unwavering commitment. This was my form of retribution, meticulously executed, legally sound, and profoundly disruptive. I was determined to ensure that Mark's unpunished past would finally begin to cast a long, disruptive shadow over his present, leaving him with no escape from the consequences of his actions. The unraveling was slow, but it was undeniable, a testament to the power of persistent, legal pressure. The silence that had once protected him was now replaced by the constant hum of legitimate scrutiny, a hum that would follow him wherever he went, a constant reminder of the consequences he could not outrun. This was my justice, delivered one legal inquiry at a time, a slow and methodical dismantling of a life built on betrayal.